As president, I have a responsibility to act with urgency and resolve when our nation faces clear and present dangers. And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger.
Sounding the alarm as the sweltering weather in the United States triggers heat alerts for over 100 million U.S. residents, President Biden holds off on declaring the climate crisis a national emergency. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. Faced with roadblocks in the US Congress and record-high temperatures in much of the United States, President Biden signaled his willingness last week to invoke emergency powers to address the climate crisis, with temperatures reaching 115 degrees Fahrenheit, 46 degrees Celsius, in Texas and Oklahoma in the south-central region of the United States. President Biden took measures to increase federal funds to help Americans affected by extreme weather events, but stopped short of declaring the climate crisis a national emergency. It's not just Congress that has created roadblocks to the president's climate agenda. In a 6-3 ruling late last month, the Supreme Court restricted the federal government's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. The U.S. electorate itself appears, as it does on so many issues, divided as well. In a recent poll, 47% of Americans said Biden's plans for tackling climate change were taking the U.S. in the wrong direction. 49% of those polled supported the measures. As many as 70% of Americans said they had been affected by an extreme weather event in the past year. The White House estimates the damage caused by extreme weather events over the last year alone to be $145 billion, with rising temperatures, floods, and hurricanes becoming more frequent. One of the states worst affected by the changing climate is South Carolina. Joining me now is Mark Sanford, the former governor of South Carolina. He served in the U.S. Congress from 1995 to 2001 and from 2013 to 2018. He is a former Republican presidential candidate who ran against Donald Trump in the 2020 election. Governor Sanford, your state, South Carolina, is particularly vulnerable to climate change. In fact, in less than 20 years from now, some of the major cities in South Carolina could be completely submerged. What is really motivating Republicans' refusal to support Biden's climate plans? I mean, is the party still in denial about the impact of climate change? Or will Republicans simply refuse to cooperate with Democrats and support any proposal the Biden administration puts forward?
No, I mean, it's not a Republican-Democrat thing. I mean, Bob Inglis, who's formerly a member of the House, has been leading an effort to try and highlight the issue of climate change and to look at market-based solutions in fixing it. I think that one of the problems that many Republicans have is sort of mechanical, which is they don't like the way in which the Biden administration would propose to fix climate change. I think the other element is, again, you have a whole host of Republicans, in fairness to your point, who are in absolute complete denial that it even exists. I think that the science suggests otherwise. I think there's a whole body of evidence that suggests otherwise. But at times in politics, people are going to believe what they believe based on their constituencies and based on the politics that drive them at home. And for that reason, you have a whole host of Republicans that absolutely deny anything's happening at all.
And you have a whole host of Republicans who say that this is about cutting spending. But surely Republicans in the House and the Senate wouldn't have approved a record-setting military budget, $45 billion above what the White House had asked for, if this was about cutting spending. Do you agree?
It's never about cutting spending. I mean, that's always a fake argument. It's what Republicans use when they're out of power. When Republicans are in power, it's not so well used. If you look at the spike in spending that occurred under the Trump administration, you didn't have a lot of Republicans talking about deficits or debt or dangers to the economy going forward based on a spike in spending. But that's sort of the latest rebuttal point based on the change in dynamics of who's in the White House.
But isn't the problem that lawmakers tend to say the right things when it comes to acting on legislation, but it's an entirely different story when it comes to actually implementing legislation or even approving it. I mean, when you were in Congress, you said climate change was a serious issue, but you also voted against a carbon tax and other measures to address it. I mean, isn't that a major part of the problem, the lack of political will?
I don't think that's a question of political will. I think it's a question of political mechanics. I mean, you can agree that something ought to be fixed, but there can be two different ways to fixing it. One of which is top down and government heavy and involves yet another tax load borne by the American public. And there are other ideas like the ones that Bob Inglis, who I mentioned earlier, formerly in the House from Greenville, South Carolina, that says, no, we can do this in market-based ways. We don't have to look always to government for the answer in a whole host of problems that confront any society. And this is something that we can do by encouraging the private sector and incentivizing the private sector. I think that's a better route to go than simply yet another tax on the American public, which is what the carbon tax is. And that's particularly the case when you look at our competitiveness against the likes of China or India, who are sort of looking the other way on the issue of carbon.
Isn't that a false argument, though? And again, isn't it about passing the buck to the private sector? I mean, House Republicans continue to resist setting a specific emissions reductions target. So do Senate Republicans. They oppose policies to reduce fossil fuel use, including regulations and taxes.
A tax is passing the buck to the private sector. The question is, which way are you going to do that? There is a cost that will be borne here. The question is it going to be government-centered or not government-centered? And I would be on the side of not government-centered.
Well, as you know, some lawmakers, Bernie Sanders and others, have been saying that oil and gas companies that are wreaking record profits, especially this year and this second quarter, should pay a windfall tax. Do you agree with them?
Not particularly. I mean, those are politically popular. And you saw them around in the 1970s. And each time that oil prices spike, you see yet a new chorus of voices saying, let's have a windfall tax.
But how do you cut carbon emissions? And if you were still in Congress, would you have voted for last year's Build Back Better plan, which would have included $500 billion for climate change programs?
I don't think I would have. Again, I don't know the details of it because I'm out of Congress and I've not been watching. I'm back in the private sector. But my sense is I probably wouldn't have. I'd have to look at the details of legislation.
But isn't that, again, part of the problem? That lawmakers will say the right things, but when it comes to acting, they just won't vote for any measures that could make a difference.
No, again, there's nothing wrong with disagreeing. Again, I've been in the private sector the last couple of years, so you're catching me flat-footed on a specific piece of legislation on what I would or wouldn't hypothetically do. I'm just saying my bias would probably be against it because I'm not for increasing the tax load on working Americans. But
again, how do you deal with the climate crisis if you don't curb your reliance on fossil fuels? I mean, you can't have it both ways. Just look at your state, South Carolina. There's an average of 25 dangerous heat days a year. That's projected to go up to 90 by 2050. That's almost 4 times more.
No, it's bad. And it's frankly worse than the flooding issue. You know, we used to not have a thing called king tides, but now they're probably 50 a year in Charleston. And it used to be there'd be 1 or 2 or maybe 3 a year. It is a problem and it is going to get worse. I completely agree with you. But what you can't have is what some in the environmental community have argued for, which is, speaking of having it both ways, which is, you know, we just want to look at solar and wind and a variety of other things as opposed to using nuclear. I've said, look, in terms of handling base load, we ought to include nuclear. And so that's where Bernie Sanders and I would disagree. Wherein somebody like him would be against nuclear as a base load alternative. I think it's something that makes sense. And it would be a meaningful place to start.
Mark Sanford, former governor of South Carolina, former congressman and former presidential candidate. Thanks so much for joining me.
Pleasure. You take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.
The western United States continues to experience extreme heat and severe drought conditions, which have sparked unrelenting wildfires in California. The state's governor announced new measures to tackle the climate crisis and reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
If you don't believe in climate change, you got to believe your own eyes. Come to California. The extremes, extreme weather, extreme heat, extreme drought, and of course the ravages of the wildfires. The idea that the U.S. Supreme Court moved to take away one of the most significant and historically powerful tools to address the ravages of climate change is incomprehensible. We've got to wake up to what's going on in the Supreme Court, and we've got to double down, quadruple down here in California and in blue states all across America.
The US remains the world's highest emitter of greenhouse gases per capita, while China is the world's largest overall producer. If invoked by the president, emergency powers could help curtail the fossil fuel industry in the United States, while the Biden administration has taken steps to undo some of the measures taken by the Trump administration to loosen regulations on the fossil fuel industry. Recent research by Princeton University shows that if current US policy remains the same, the US will overshoot its emissions target by 32% in 2030. The US has some of the world's biggest fossil fuel subsidies per capita. According to Open Secrets, the top oil and gas companies spent more than $12.4 million on lobbying in the first quarter of 2022. So can the US rein in big oil and gas companies to address the climate crisis before it is too late? Joining me now to discuss the implications of political inaction is Benjamin Zaitchik, a professor and climate scientist in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Professor Zaitchik, the new study which you co-authored shows the cascading effect, the domino effect of climate change. How is the current heat wave that we're seeing here in the US, like much of the rest of the world, making it more likely that multiple extreme weather events will actually occur all at the same time?
Right. Well, this domino effect is something we're all very concerned about. And now the study we looked at asked a specific question about whether a drought could make a heat wave worse. And we found that it can, and it did in last summer's event. Now this year, we're seeing many different kind of events happening. Some of those, as we study them, I expect we will find the same kind of cascading event where different climate changes are building upon each other. But there's also the fact that we're seeing so many at the same time. And we can think of this as a kind of a global compound event happening right now, where it's compound and that we're seeing multiple regions affected by extreme heat at the same time. And there's simply no question that we're seeing more of that and that we will continue to see the frequency and intensity of such compound, almost global scale events increasing as climate change continues.
But how do you then protect against this likely scenario, this cascading effect, if politicians aren't willing to take significant measures like carbon pricing or anything else that could hold them and the fossil fuel industry more accountable for their emissions?
Yes, and of course, ultimately, that's the solution that we need. In our work, we work on what's sometimes considered the complementary side of this, the adaptation efforts, the resilience building. And when you look at something like extreme heat, there actually is a tremendous amount that individuals and communities can do. This is everything from being more ready for events in an acute way as they're coming, with better early warning systems, good communication, networks of communities and families being able to check in on each other and protect vulnerable people. And also longer term strategies, such as trying to design and build for communities in which you see less concentration of heat and there are more refuges for people seeking relief from heat.
But that still isn't happening. We've been talking about it for at least 4 decades. I mean, have we reached a critical turning point, a decisive moment? Because as you know, the US Congress is still refusing to pass key legislation. No one really expects the US to meet its emissions target by 2030, let alone its net zero pledge by 2050. Whether the president does invoke a national emergency or not, will it really matter? If those who need to be reined in, if the fossil fuel industry keeps getting all the subsidies and incentives it does without any cost or consequence?
Couldn't agree more. And here in the United States, we certainly are looking for this kind of a federal momentum, federal solutions. At the same time, this is a shared global challenge that involves people working locally, working at state and regional level here in the United States, as well as nationally. And so there are many opportunities. Do we need strong actors like the federal government of the United States to step up more quickly and more dramatically than they have? Absolutely no question. But at the same time, we're seeing a lot of momentum in the form of media and communications, education, citizens movements, and we're seeing more and more city and state efforts, particularly when it comes to both their adaptation needs and to justice-oriented work on mitigating emissions locally.
Hold on, though. Are we seeing enough progress when it comes to cities and states? Because a majority of cities in the United States, well over 50%, according to a Brookings study that was published last year, haven't met their pledges. Some of them haven't even tracked their emissions progress.
That's right. We're not doing enough. And in my view, what we need.
How do you change this?
I think the way you do it is by showing success. And so, though it's true we would love to see the majority of cities and ultimately all cities really be leaders on this issue, the reality is that's a smaller subset that are showing leadership. But in those smaller cities, we're seeing both statements of great ambition, which absolutely will require follow through that's going to be very difficult. And we're also seeing on the ground efforts to work with communities in a manner that will prepare them for climate change and draw attention to the greater need to mitigate. So building this political groundswell. Now, it's much later, it's not as fast as we would like to see, but nevertheless, this action is happening. And I think that when you look locally, community level in the United States and at certain leading states, you're seeing a lot more reason for optimism than you might see in the federal action that we're still waiting on.
Let's look at your own city, Baltimore. In your recent studies, you've also looked at the environmental justice impact of extreme weather events and how economically disadvantaged groups are especially vulnerable to excessive heat exposure. I mean, how do you explain that temperatures are particularly high in certain areas where disadvantaged communities live, like in your own state?
Yeah, and this is a major phenomenon in Baltimore and in cities certainly across the United States and in some ways across the world, where we simply see that places where communities have been systematically marginalized, perhaps they don't have the same kind of ownership or resources to manage the landscape around them, or perhaps the city is neglecting the need to fulfill the city's responsibility in these areas, you end up with a situation with large areas of concrete and impervious surfaces, reduced tree cover, fewer parks and refuges for people to take advantage of, and weak maintenance of those that exist. And so in those sense, we really see extreme heat in this case in cities as a clear example of environmental justice and climate injustice that's going on. And working with those communities and with the city to identify both how that's happened historically and through continuing unjust policies has been an entry point for us to look at ways in which, again, both the city through taking responsibility and the communities can improve their environment and reduce heat that's affecting those communities.
Benjamin Zaitchik, great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
President Biden's climate envoy, John Kerry, has expressed hope that the U.S. will take on a leading role at the next UN Global Conference on Climate Change. Scheduled to take place in Egypt in November, it aims to build on the commitments made at the last global conference in Scotland.
I am an optimist about what we've achieved last November in Glasgow if we build on it. Almost 200 nations came together and took unprecedented steps in the cause of the climate battle. They agreed to pursue efforts to limit the Earth's warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and agreed that that would require reducing greenhouse gas emissions by a minimum of 45% by 2030 and achieving net zero emissions by 2050.
If governments fail to act on their commitments and pledges, what more can be done to put pressure on elected officials and the oil and gas industry? Jean Su is Senior Attorney and Energy Justice Director at the Center for Biodiversity. She's also part of the People versus Fossil Fuels Coalition, which has been urging President Biden to declare a climate emergency and stop all new fossil fuel projects. Jean Su, just last week, President Biden called climate change a clear and present danger. And earlier this week, there were congressional staffers staging a sit-in because of what they consider the failure of the Biden administration, of Congress, to take any meaningful climate action. Should the president have gone further than he has by declaring this a national emergency, and will it make any difference?
Yes. President Biden should absolutely declare a climate emergency. He already acknowledged that there is one. I don't think there's any questionable fact that we're all experiencing it. And by declaring a climate emergency, he actually would unlock the entire suite of his executive powers that he's always had in his quiver to beat the climate catastrophe back.
But only a handful of these powers would actually affect climate change. I mean, how much of a real difference would it make in the large scheme of things?
So when we think about the climate emergency, we actually have to think about it through the lens of unlocking all of his executive powers. So legally, if he were to declare a climate emergency, it would unlock a subset of emergency powers. But at the same time, if he declares one, it actually allows him to use all of his powers at once. Some of the most important emergency powers that he can use can really make an important dent in climate. For one, we can actually reinstate the crude oil export ban, which is actually the equivalent of stopping 42 coal plants of pollution. We can also stop the fossil fuel finance that ranges in the hundreds of billions every year that leave our shores to fossil fuel projects abroad. And those have actually been found to be funding hundreds of megatons of carbon every single year. So
but do you expect any of this to happen? Do you expect the administration to curb the fossil fuel industry, to restrict drilling on federal lands, to end crude oil exports, among other things? I mean, we know Biden is facing a tough balancing act between the response to global warming and the economic reality of high gas prices here in the US. I mean, realistically, will the US ever halt crude oil exports, limit oil and gas drilling?
So realistically, I expect the Biden administration to carefully plan this out. These emergency powers, as well as his normal executive powers, allow him to also speed the renewable energy transition that we need right now. We actually saw the Biden administration make huge advances in clean energy manufacturing in June by pulling the Defense Production Act to get our manufacturing going. As we're getting clean energy up on its way, as well as electric transportation, which we're asking for him now, I think that sets the stage for allowing him to also curb fossil fuels at the same time. One of the disappointing parts about the Build Back Better Act is that it did not confront our fossil fuel boogeyman. And that's exactly what President Biden needs to do. He has total unilateral power to stop all new oil leases, for example. New oil leases don't start generating oil and gas until years from now. That's not going to help us in our current situation of inflation and our oil issues. We can stop those now and at the same time ramp up our renewable energy and curb the future lock-in of fossil fuels.
And how much longer can people wait for real action to be taken, given the election cycles we're constantly in here in the United States? How do you rein in the power of big oil and big gas, the fossil fuel industry, to reduce carbon levels? I mean, there are today dozens of countries around the world with a carbon price. The US is not one of them. Could there ever be a price on carbon here in the US, given the power of this industry and its lobbyists and the unwillingness of most lawmakers to support any new forms of taxation?
Look, we are in a situation where Congress has failed to pass the most important piece of climate legislation that we have before 2030. They are very much influenced by the fossil fuel industry. And unfortunately, pieces like subsidies, like passing a social cost of carbon, those are all part of Congress. But at the same time, President Biden has enormous executive powers in his own quiver that he can use to combat fossil fuels. A lot of those start with the approvals that he gives to fossil fuel pipelines, like the Mountain Valley pipeline and the Formosa petrochemical plant in Louisiana. These are fossil fuel projects that are poisoning environmental justice communities right now in the United States and that have a huge, important carbon pollution footprint. These are things that the Biden administration can actually stop unilaterally, and he needs to start that way in order to confront the fossil fuel industry and their dirty influence over our government.
Jean Sue, great to have your perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Now, while climate change has been on the West's political back burner since the start of the war in Ukraine, record temperatures are a stark reminder that nature doesn't yield to politics. And with climate activists urging the administration to heal the United States' insatiable thirst of fossil fuels, the reality is that no president, Republican or Democrat, has ever dared to take on the big oil industry. With high gasoline prices fueling, in part, inflation, this is very unlikely to change anytime soon with looming elections. But President Biden could take bold steps by declaring a national climate emergency, as a coalition of over 1,200 groups have been urging him to do over the last couple of years. His climate envoy, John Kerry, intimated that much. This could unlock 136 statutory emergency powers available to the president, only a handful of which relate to climate change. But under the National Emergencies Act, the Pentagon could receive additional funds to upgrade its air and naval bases to mitigate the threat of rising sea levels, hurricanes, wildfires, floods, and extreme heat and drought. Over the last decade, top Pentagon officials have argued that climate change is a threat multiplier, whether it is overseas or within the United States. This threat will, quote, continue to have worsening implications for U.S. national security, according to U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, whose Department of Defense is one of the world's biggest energy consumers. According to a recent study, the Pentagon releases over 55 million tons of carbon every year, more than entire nations like Hungary, Sweden, or Portugal. And so, in short, if the President uses his executive powers to grant more funding to the Pentagon, on top of the record-setting $858 billion in military spending, which was recently approved by the Senate for fiscal year 2023, the system will continue blinking red as Republicans and Democratic lawmakers will fund even more the country's worst carbon offender. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team here in Washington. Thanks for watching. See you next time.